Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a 1/35 scale workable track link tutorial and review video for the T80E1 tracks, which of course are needed here for this 1/35 scale M46 Patton. This model here is the subject matter of its own model showcase video, which the link should be found in the video description below. But this model here is a 1/35 scale M46 kit from Dragon. The Dragon kit, by the way, is an excellent model, and it's definitely one of those older kits that aged like wine. However, the biggest ding that this older kit does have, and the newer ones from Takom have a similar problem, are the assembly method for the Caterpillar tracks. You see, this model here is plagued with the individual link and elect track method, which is, by the way, the worst track method possible for a 1/35 scale model. And of course, in order to fully complete this one here, I need to have a replacement aftermarket solution. And the solution that I'm using is this set that we have here from AFV Club. Whoa, 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 don't leave, don't leave. Hang on, before you click the X button and, storm off in frustration, just hear me out. The 1/35 scale T80E1 track link sets here from AFV Club are a, shall we say, controversial one. Not really controversial, it's just that these tracks here tend to be panned, relentlessly by the by the 1/35 scale community, which is funny if they only put the same effort into basing link and light track, but that's a topic for another day. These tracks here are some of the oldest workable track link options out there for a Pershing or a Patton type kit, and have been on the market now since about the year 2000. So digging right in, like I touched upon before, these pieces are made by AFV Club and have been on the market since the year 2000. They come in a few different types of patterns of box, where this one here is the current production version. However, they did have a slightly different design box art that had more of a line drawing version of an M46 or an M26 Pershing on the cover. The components, however, are identical to the ones regardless of the box art type. These tracks here are also somewhat affordable. They can be had anywhere from 10 to about 15 or 20 US dollars, depending where you obtain them from. These ones here I picked up off of eBay, and that was roughly the price that I paid. One positive attribute is that because these tracks are so universally despised, they're really easy to come by, and the prices are fairly low. So if you watch this video and you figure out how to assemble these tracks, or follow my format of assembling these tracks, you should be able to basically life hack your way in getting a set for practically, nothing. So the biggest problem with these tracks is this right here. On the back of the box art, we have the instructions. And this is the number one problem that causes the difficulty that people have with these tracks. If you follow these instructions, you will not be able to build these tracks. You will have nothing but a catastrophic disaster, a pile of broken links, and basically a waste of time. So, and not to mention money, and these days that's really important. So we're not going to utilize this assembly technique to assemble these tracks. Instead, we're going to do a different type of format. However, as for what's in the bag, we have two of these sealed stacks of runners. The tracks are molded in this brownish, red-brown type coloring, which is typical for the AFV Club tracks. And I've seen a bunch of other companies like Amusing Hobby mold their tracks in a color that's very similar. What's cool is that the tracks or the runners are stackable to protect them from shipping. Occasionally you may have one that's crushed, but more or less they tend to come in pretty good condition. Here you see the tracks right here on the sprue. We have the links themselves, the end connectors, as well as the guide horns. And the real difference between this set and the versions for the VV or the HVSS Sherman is just with this section over here. Obviously this one's for a Pershing, it has the teeth, while the Sherman variant has the big hollow block type guide tooth. Other than that, the tracks are identical and they assemble in the exact same configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and start this by dispelling the very first and most prominent myth about these tracks, and that's the material that they are made in. There is this rumor out there, and I've seen it circulating quite often and frequently on the modeling community, stating that these tracks here are made from cast resin, and that is just not the case. That is patently false. These tracks here are made from injection molded plastic. Obviously, you can't exactly get a runner type situation like this with poured cast resin. The pieces are indeed plastic, so let's go ahead and put that to bed right now. The other thing is with the fragility, and this is kind of where the resin myth kind of comes to play, is because these pieces, even though they are made out of plastic, they kind of have a resin type fragility to them, and that is the biggest problem with these tracks with the assembly, is that if you try to follow the instructions, these pieces are going to buckle and the track is just going to fall apart on you, neither of which is ideal. If we go ahead and get the pieces closer to the camera, you can see the frailness of the pieces in question. Note on the link itself, we have the pins coming out on the ends over here for the end connectors, the 2 pins here for the guide teeth, and the pieces are 100% in scale. This is to 1/35 scale. Unfortunately, they are also very, very, very fragile because of the type of plastic and also with the thinnesses of these parts. And this is where the problem comes in. However, I've assembled about 6 or 7 of these sets, so I can tell you for a fact that they are indeed not impossible to put together. And when they go together, they actually look pretty good. However, to get them together, we're going to need some tools. So let me move these aside, and here go the tools that you are going to need. First, and the most obvious, is a pair of clean cut snips. The second is some very fine sandpaper that we have here. This is 100 grit sandpaper, can be found in any hardware store. The next is a sharp hobby knife. In this case, I use a miniature box cutter, but an X-Acto will do just fine. And the next are a set of needle files, specifically the flat needle file that we have here. Also, to assist with the assembly, is going to be a bottle of super glue. So to start with the track assembly, the very first thing you need to do is to remove the links from their molded surfaces. And this is where a lot of people already run into problems. You can't just go ahead and snip these off like you would any other type of plastic part, because of the way the 2 pieces are connected with that center, or I should say those 2 center columns over there. If you snap one of these pieces off one, then try to do the other, you're going to add a bend point, and the link is going to bend and shift on you. If that happens, the material has been compromised, and the link has a good chance of just splitting in half. Regardless, that's not something you want to have happen. So to remove the pieces, you're going to use your clean cut snip, but you're going to remove them in an even manner. And what I mean by that is you're going to apply a little bit of pressure right here, right where the link makes contact with the column. Just a little bit of pressure, and then you're going to do the exact same thing to the one on the opposite side. As you can see, the piece is starting to buckle. And then once done, the link is removed. Now at this point here, the link is very fragile. It could bend in half and snap, and also those little end connector pieces can snap too. So just want to set that aside and commence with the remainder of the removal process. This is something that arguably can be a bit tedious, but if you take your time and you pace yourself, you should be able to get this done in fairly no time. The trick is to do everything evenly. Like that there. I'm going to go ahead, for the sake of the video, just remove one more of these pieces, and then I'll describe what's going to happen in the next step. With the links off of the sprue, you now have to deburr the little segment over there where the links were found on the runner. And this is absolutely important and crucial, because if there is any sort of particulate left in these areas over here, this will inhibit how the tracks go together, and it's going to cause further problems. To do this, you can't just use your hobby knife and just trim away, because, again, of the fragility of the pad itself. The best way to do it is with a needle file or with some sandpaper, and you just run along the surface over here in this type of format. Just like so. After a few passes, the link is completely deburred, and then you could carry on with the next step. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and make sure the other links match up in spec. In addition to the needle file, you could also polish down further with running the piece up and down some sandpaper. Obviously, when you're doing this, you want to have a good grasp of the part, and you want to polish it away in a nice, even format, so you don't have the piece canted. In addition to that, you also want to go up and down, or side to side. Just make sure that it's in a nice linear motion to prevent any wear and tear onto the columns that are mentioned previously. I cannot stress enough how important those center portions are because of how easily broken they can be. So with the 3 links now deburred, it's time for removal of the other components found here on the sprue. And this is where you have to completely take the instructions that the kit gives you and just throw them in the trash. Because if you do, you're going to have problems. So the biggest problem with the links is actually with these teeth that we have here. If the camera zooms in, you'll see that the teeth have this shape to them where it looks like the part can just snap and plug into place. On paper, that's a really good design, and it should make for an easy installation. Unfortunately, this is what gives the tracks the raw reputation that they have. Because of the shape here, and in combination with the material that these are molded in, the little pins that are found right here in the middle will crack before they will be able to snap and plug into place, and that is the big problem. So in order to get the teeth to fit on, we do have to make a slight alteration to the geometry of these pieces here. Fortunately, it's one that's really easily done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip the tooth off. You could polish or deburr further with some sandpaper. You could use the X-Acto for this, or you could use the needle file. Either way will lead to Rome. And once the part's deburred, it's then ready for installation. With the teeth deburred, the next thing to address is the injection pin that we have right here on the inner portion here of the tooth. There's a cylinder that's molded in this section over here that has to go. If this piece is not addressed, you're not going to be able to assemble any track. This is again done with a needle file. You basically just run it up and down the surface here. After a few passes, the nub is history. Once the nubs are removed, it's then time to change the shape of those clips. And the way to do that is you need to open up these sections over here. And the best way to do that is to take the sandpaper, bend it like I am doing right now, and then from here you could just go ahead and run up and down these areas like so. This is going to remove that extra bit of plastic that's creating the snap point. And once the material is removed, you can see exactly how open that area is. Once that area is opened, you can now insert it into the link without causing any sort of damage. I'm going to do the same thing to the opposite side. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort. As you can see, it's like 2 or 3 passes, and the piece is now fully opened up. Before I go ahead and start assembling the tracks, of course, you guessed it, these ones here are going to go through the same procedure. And after a couple hours, you'll have the track starting to resemble this type of a format. So the band on top of here is fully complete at the appropriate length, and the one down here is at the final stretch, as you can clearly see. The set gives you more than enough for the job at hand, so you'll have enough tracks, or enough links, or enough parts, I should say, to assemble 2 whole track bands, enough for 1 M26 or M46 Patton, and you'll have a few other links left over as spares, or also to be used as a holy crap, I broke a link type emergency. On the track bands you see here, I did not have any sort of casualties. I was able to assemble them absolutely perfectly without any sort of problems with the steps that I touched upon earlier. The only thing to watch out for is that when you're deburring some of the sections here on the teeth, they tend to want to fling off and have a real bad habit of going to lost partia, but fortunately, I was able to track all the ones that flung out, so I was lucky in that regard. But that is something you need to be concerned of. Sadly, the information that I filmed with the track links getting assembled was lost on a corrupted memory stick. However, here you can see with the pieces fully painted and installed on the vehicle exactly how they go together. So basically, when you have all of the tolerances adjusted off of the following components, it's then time for the installation, or I should say time for the assembly. What you're going to do is you're going to take the track pads, you're going to line up the tooth on the center, and then you're going to need to secure them in place with the two end connectors. And this is where, again, you're going to need to slightly deviate from the kit's instructions in order to get the parts assembled properly. If you try to assemble the part as per the kit, where you just simply insert the end connectors in the appropriate locations, the pieces are just going to fall apart on you in a very short manner. So on my workable track link, specifically ones with this type of a design, what I like to do is I like to add a small little drop of glue on one of the pins and only on that one pin on each side. What happens is that when you do that and you install the end connector, that small little glue is going to solidify in place and it's going to keep it where it needs to be. However, since the drop of glue is not on the other pin, this will have the effect of creating a hinge and the link will be fully functional, but it is not going to be something that can fall or disintegrate apart on you. When you're doing this, the most important thing to consider is the orientation on the pins and specifically which ones you apply the glue to. You have to apply the glue on the exact same pin on every single link. Otherwise, if you don't, the thing is going to glue solid and you're basically going to negate the entire reason why you're assembling a workable track link system. Of course, fortunately, the next scenes survive the memory stick just fine, and you will see the functionality and flexibility of these tracks in operation, but here you get to see a quick little test of it right over here, showing how good the tracks articulate. The other thing you want to pay attention to is, again, orientation. Orientation is the key when you're assembling any sort of track system, specifically a workable track link system. So this is true for not just the track pads themselves. Obviously, you don't want to have the chevrons switched on you unless you're trying to do that non-directional type tactic. That is a actual thing that tankers are taught. However, in realistic practice, it's not really done very often. But as a side note, yes, there is this tactic where to throw off the direction of the tracks that are left on the ground, you have every fifth link inverted. So some of them are going in the downward direction, then occasionally you have one or two going in the reverse direction. This is a tactic that is taught in tank school. However, again, in practice, it's not really something that's really executed, if ever, actually. I've heard people talking about it, but I've never personally seen it in any photographs or anything of the sort. So, again, that is something to consider. Regardless, when you are assembling the tracks, be aware of the actual thread pattern. So, in addition to the thread pattern needing to be paid attention to, it's also the end connectors. The end connector detailing is interior exterior specific. On the exterior here, you have this like little bone looking like shape, and on the interior you have a small little fastener, hopefully this comes out on screen, right over here, that is on the inside center. This is again something you want to pay attention to because these only get installed in one direction, and if you're installing the components and you screw up and you mount one inverted, obviously since the pieces are glued, you're not exactly going to be able to take the things apart. Now, let's just say you do make a mistake and you mess up one or two things, either direction or orientation. Fortunately, this is where the super glue comes in handy because there is a solvent for super glue that is plastic safe. I have the link to the Amazon listing in the video description. If that happens to you, fear not, just put a couple drops of that stuff on the surface. After a minute or two, it'll seep in there and it'll dissolve the super glue and you will be able to remove the component. This is why I strongly recommend the use of super glue on plastic models as opposed to other cements, because it does age better normally than regular cement, but also it is reversible. If for whatever reason you need to change something or rearrange something, you can do that without causing any permanent damage to the plastic itself. So this is something else also to consider. On a similar note, when it comes time for installing the end connectors in place, you want to make sure that they are all on in an even manner. When you're installing them, a lot of times you'll be moving the track around, and while the glue is still wet, the piece can sometimes shift on you, and if that happens, the tooth is not, or I should say the end connector is not going to be firmly pressed against the side, and it's going to cause problems when it comes time for alignment on the sprocket, as well as also alignment on mounting onto the tank. Again, you want to keep aware of this. Also, one last thing I want to mention is that unlike the track teeth, where, as I touched upon before, you do have to do some modifications to get rid of that injection pin and also to open up the tolerances. For the end connectors, fortunately, that's not the case, and the pieces snip off very easily with just a pair of clean-cut snips. Now, on the box, on the rear portion, it has you installing them all in one shot. This is again something that I hazard against because it can potentially cause problems, specifically again with the glue and also with the alignment. Remember, these little pins here are very, very frail and fragile. I cannot stress that enough. And if you try that system, this lends itself to potentially putting stress on certain locations, which may lead to parts breaking. Obviously, that is something you want to avoid, and I personally found it better to install the end connectors individually as opposed to doing 5 at a time, as what's illustrated on the box instructions. But again, this is just my personal experience, and this is something that I do recommend. Luckily, the insertion of the end connectors is very easy. The holes that are molded into these sections are really good with the tolerances, and there's no shoving or any other type of manhandling required in order to get these components fitted in place. And once they're fitted in place, and once they are solidified and all uniformed, the track goes together fairly easily. One other thing that I need to stress at this point is that when you're assembling the tracks and you're getting close to the end, you really want to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of tension required. And with this method, the problem is it's great for assembling links. However, if you need to remove a link or two, that's when things become problematic because the pieces are super glued in place. However, if this does happen to you, it's not a problem. And this is why I stress using super glue as opposed to standard cement, because the super glue is not permanent. If the need be arises and you have to remove a link or you break something and you need to do a repair, you can use this material that we have here, which is called super solvent. I've touched upon this material in a number of other videos. It is absolutely awesome in deburring, or I should say dislodging the super glue, and after about 5 minutes or so, the glue will be totally dissolved and you can pop the piece off and everything will be okay. And this, most importantly, does not harm the plastic finish found on these components here. So, but again, this is something that's only to be used in an emergency setting. In order to get the correct number of links, the best and really sheer bet way to do it is to test periodically the fit on the model. At this point here, the wheels should be installed, and from here you can go ahead and basically loop everything together and see how the tension is, if it's too tight, if it's too loose, or you get to see exactly how many more links you need to go before you can call it a day. On the Dragon M46 here, this procedure is made even more easily because of the way the kit is designed. The outer section of the row wheels are separate halves, and so you could install the first halves like I've done here, and this will really act like a really good jig in order to put the tracks in their appropriate space. And then at the final installation, which I'll touch upon later in the video, you'll see exactly how easy the last layer goes on, completing the look. However, if you are doing a rebuild, or if that's just not an option, the wheels are already assembled, fear not, you can still test the length of the track even with the suspension in place. The most important wheels that must not be glued on at this point are the rear sprockets. These should not be glued onto the model. If they are, you're going to have a bit more work to do. But if they're not like they are on this model over here, it does streamline the build immensely. And by the way, this is the case for all workable track link options, and even single piece vinyl tracks for the same reasons. You don't want to have these parts glued on at this time. So setting aside the Patton, you can now see what the tracks look like fully assembled and also fully flexible. As you can see, once they are assembled, they have a very nice flow and articulation to them. And that whole dreaded myth of these tracks being not easily assembled or being assembled at all is obviously thrown to the basket. So the tracks are nice and articulated, which is absolutely perfect because you need to wrap them around the sprocket. And the sprocket on the Dragon Patton here, and I believe the Pershing is the same way, the tracks do fit, they do time, however, they are a bit on the snugger side. So if I go ahead and just take a sample section, try to loop it around, you can see that the teeth aren't exactly going into their indexing points. However, this will fit in place. You just have to carefully massage the tracks to do so. The teeth will find their nice little sweet spot in between the end connectors, and once in place, they will time perfectly around the sprocket. However, one thing that I must stress is, again, the fragility of the tracks. If you're trying to push these pieces in place, you might have the tendency to take your thumb and to just put pressure onto the center portion of the track there. And if you do, you're going to cause some breakage. The force of your thumb is going to put a lot of stress right here in this middle section, and the tracks are going to buckle like this. And if that happens, yeah, let's just say it's not good. So you have to be very careful when it comes time to massage these pieces in place, and you'll see that again at the tail end of the video when I'm actually fitting them onto the model. But rest assured, these tracks will fit and time on the Dragon sprockets. As for the Tacom or any other make, sadly I don't have that information, so that will probably be best by doing a Google search. But you have to wade through people saying that these tracks cannot be assembled when clearly they can be. So once the tracks are assembled, by the way, because of the Murphy's Law being what it is, any wacky incident can happen to them where they can be broken or things can fall on them, or you could drop them into a vat of turpentine or paint thinner. And by the way, all those things I just mentioned are actually things that has happened to me in the past with these tracks. So, you know, it would be really anticlimactic to go through all of that to assemble these tracks only to break them, you know, before the things get painted and or installed. So when the time comes and you have a full set, you know, it pays to put it in a really, really safe area and then not mess with it until it comes time for painting and final installation. But yeah, Murphy's Law is a real, yeah, all those things I mentioned, by the way, actually did happen before. So before I go ahead and assemble the last length of tracks here, one addendum I want to bring up are with the teeth cleaning. So as I mentioned before, on this pattern of the AFV Club track sets, on the center portion of the tooth here, there is this nub that protrudes from this section. This has to be removed, as I touched upon before. However, before I said you can just polish away with a needle file once the pieces are removed off the sprue, and although you can do that, another quicker way to do it is with a pair of clean cut snips here, and just go ahead and snip them off on the entire set. Now, although these pieces are snipped away, there are still some shards of the nub that are left over, and this still needs to be polished away. However, this is done with the needle file with the same technique that I mentioned before, but now it requires a lot less effort compared to trying to amputate the entire stub. On the end connectors here, in order to remove them off the sprue, the best way to do this is kind of like the way it's mentioned in the instructions, where you take a clean cut snip and you go to the face section over here and you carefully cut right below that line. You see, with the way these tracks are designed, the end connectors have this extra little tab that's present on the surface, and this tab is integrally molded into the plastic part. However, if someone is overzealous with their polishing or removing, they can easily amputate this away. The AFV Club kit does have the little tab present, and it's separate from the sprue, which is in that inclined section of plastic right over there. The clean cut snips, you just go to the appropriate location, like right over here, and then once the piece is snipped off, you will still have the tab present. However, you're not quite done with that setup just yet. Once the track is fully assembled, what I like to do is I like to wrap it up in a coil like this and take some of the sandpaper that I touched upon before, and I very lightly just run it up the surface very, very briefly and very, very lightly. This is going to have the effect of polishing down all of the end connectors in one fell swoop so that it deburrs any shards or remnants that remain on the surface. Obviously, you need to do this to both sides and do it to both tracks. And while I was assembling the track, I forgot to mention one last important thing. Before, when I was showing the opening process, I was holding the tooth in my hands and I was doing the job. And that does work. However, a plier like this will greatly assist in the procedure. This allows you to hold the tooth nice and firmly, and it'll allow you to then hit it with the sandpaper in the locations that I touched upon before. This is the last tooth over here that needs to get the procedure done to it, so I'm going to go ahead and just go through the process one last time, where first I use a needle file to polish down the face of it, like so. Once the face is polished down, I clasp it in the plier, and then I could go ahead and polish it down with the sandpaper. Of course, you need to first hit the side of the tooth because that's where the burr was from where it was connected to the sprue. And then with the paper bent, I just go up and down the surface over here for a few passes until finally the opening is now widened. The sandpaper pad, by the way, goes quite a distance. I was able to get 3/4 of one track before needing to swap out the paper. Eventually what happens is that this here wears out, obviously from all the rubbing, and if that happens, you just simply just pull it down slightly and you'll have a fresh crease line over here to continue your sanding. But after a while, even this area here gets worn out just from all the teeth that get scored on that surface. But again, sandpaper is not something that's really hard to come by, nor is it very particularly expensive. So and that's literally it. So I'm going to continue with the remainder of the assembly, and then we'll cut back to when the tracks are painted. And it all comes down to this. Once the tracks are painted and weathered, they are then ready for installation onto the model. As for the paintwork itself, this is done with both spray paints, airbrushing, as well as dry brushing. For the spray paints, the entire tracks are spray painted with a coat of flat black. The flat black that I use is just El Cheapo flat black spray paint. Even though these are workable track links, they are made from plastic, and because of that, I really don't recommend using some of the more expensive brands of paint out there, like from Rust-Oleum specifically. For the spray paint here, the cheap stuff from Home Depot works perfectly fine. The flat black is just used basically as a primer, more or less, and then over it, it gets airbrushed several colors of acrylics, giving you the weathered look that we have here. The scratch surfaces are done via the dry brush, and I've touched upon this technique in a number of videos. The one other thing to mention about the Patton track is that although this portion here, or I should say with this parent track, the exterior would be metal, the interior portion of the pads would actually be rubber, so they are painted and weathered in a way to replicate that. This is definitely important and something that several people out there tend to overlook or miss, and it's something that can hurt the build if not done properly. Fortunately, painting them is really easy to do. You just paint it with flat black or to me a rubber black, and then you could just weather accordingly. Obviously, you don't want to have any scratched steel on these sections here for reasons that should be fairly obvious. So once the tracks are done, like I mentioned before, it's time to get them onto the model. The first thing that you need to do is to get the orientation correct. It would be really anticlimactic to go through this entire ordeal only to install the tracks on in reverse. This is not the orientation of the tracks. They are this way. The chevrons on these tanks always go in this direction. For the installation, I'm going to go ahead and snail this one up just so I could get it out of the way. Again, you want to be very careful with this because stupid things can and will indeed happen. Okay, so with the track out of the way, the first thing to do is to time it onto the sprocket. Before you do that, you want to make sure that the sprockets slide in and out of the final drive in a nice, smooth manner, and they aren't sticky. The reason why I mention this is that when you're painting and varnishing the model, layers of paint can build up on the stems here as well as also in the hole, and this can cause the tolerances to be a bit tight, and when you're trying to do a install like this, it's really best if the thing's going nice and smooth. It'll definitely solve some headaches. So this is something that was taken care of off screen. I went ahead and with my X-Acto over here, just went up and down these surfaces and scraped off the layers of paint. Once that is complete, you can see exactly how easy the sprockets go into place. Once you have the sprocket tolerances taken out, it's then time to begin the procedure. And the first thing you need to do is time the track onto the sprocket. What I like to do is I like to figure out exactly which sections of the track are going to be visible. Okay, and once that's done, it's then time to begin the actual timing process. And what timing is, this is what's referred to as when the teeth are making contact with the appropriate sections on the sprocket. As I touched upon before, on the Dragon kit here, the tracks do fit on, but they are on in a fairly snug manner. So you want to be very careful with the timing. Of course, if the tracks are not fit onto the sprocket right, it's going to hurt the look of the build. And fortunately, the tracks do go on. They just take a little bit of persuasion, not a whole lot, just a little bit of force being applied on these two ends over here in order to get the pieces seated in place. Again, you have to be very, very careful with this, because if you put pressure right here in the center portions will buckle, as I touched upon before, and that's going to lead to a whole heap and load of trouble. So you definitely want to avoid that. Me, as what we just saw, I put my thumbs on the ends, and I carefully apply just a little bit of pressure, not a whole lot, for the teeth to go into their appropriate locations. I like to time it where half the sprocket has the track present, like so, because once it goes into place, the track may pop off some of the sections over here, but it'll do it in a natural manner, and it'll actually help the look of the build overall. So once that is complete, you then go ahead and start with the install. Now, on the Dragon M46 here, this is very easily done at this point because the outer section of the road wheels are not fitted at this time, as I mentioned earlier. If the outer sections are installed, nothing changes really. You could just go ahead and just slide the sections into place, and then they will go into their appropriate locations. It takes just a little bit more extra fiddling, but it can still be done regardless. In this type of configuration over here, that's not necessarily the case. So I go ahead, line up the sprocket. I carefully index it over the road wheels. And of course, like I always mention in these videos, this is one of those things where it's more easily done off camera than on camera, but it's still getting done regardless. So as you can see, I fished it through those areas over there, and the sprocket is fully seated in the final drive. At this point here, it's now time to connect the two track bands. Right over there. To connect the track bands, the first thing you need to do is pin on the guide tooth. Also, you'll notice the guide teeth and even the end connectors have been pre-painted and weathered along with the remainder of the track to keep continuity. So the guide teeth already had those same modifications that I touched upon earlier, so they should just plug directly into place without any real problems. Of course, when you're doing a technique like this, or a setup like this, you want to be as slow and methodical as possible, and you don't want to rush. Because that is how you end up making mistakes and breaking things that you really shouldn't. Okay, once the tooth is in place, it tends to hold the sections together somewhat, not that strong, but it's enough for you to go ahead and fit the end connectors in place. So I'm going to go ahead, snip off the end connectors, then get them mounted to the model. These simply just get snipped off in the same manner that I touched upon earlier. And then once snipped off, they get fitted in place. So here you can see that I mounted on the first end connector, and it just slid on into place. Unlike the other ones on the track, I didn't glue this one on because with the layers of paint built up on the pegs over here, it does a pretty decent job in keeping them in with just friction. So that's one step out of the way. However, if it is a bit loose, obviously you could just add a small little drop of glue and it'll be suffice at doing the job at hand. Then all you gotta do is put the last connector on, squeeze it in place, and huzzah, you now have the track fitted to the vehicle. Obviously, it's just rinse, wash, and repeat at this point, but just done to the opposite side. And once the outer layer of road wheels are installed, the track installation is 100% complete. And once installed, you can really see how well they look on the model as a whole. Now, of course, I need to mention, although these tracks are considered to be workable, no, you cannot play with the model in this regard. These tracks are far too frail for you to push the thing across a carpet, and I know this sounds funny to say, but there are some people out there that may construe that because of the working moniker. However, that's really more or less not the case. But with the tracks installed, you can really see how they articulate around the various curve sections over here, which is something that just doesn't work out very well with individual link and length. I don't care what anyone says, they never look as good as something with a workable or even a single piece vinyl type nature. So from here, the model can actually slip into completion. I'll go ahead and do that off camera, and that's going to be more or less discussed in the model showcase video that's going to be for this example over here. However, one thing I do want to mention is that I am going to be assembling a quick little set over here and using them for the spares that are mounted right here on this rack because, you know, I might as well. I have some links spare ready to go, and I could simply use them for that purpose. It's going to take some slight mods, but that's out of the scope of this video. So, basically, in the end, these tracks here are always something that enhance the look of the build. Now, like I've mentioned before, the AFV Club specific workable track links for these Pattons and Pershings have a really negative stigma to them. However, you can see that if you take the proper precautions when assembling the track, they are far from being impossible to put together. And not only do they go together very well, but look awesome once fitted to the vehicle. In addition to this pattern track, AFV Club also makes the rubber chevron variant of the Pershing track. And you can see here this was from a Pershing that I did a little while ago. And the tracks are basically the exact same in quality. However, one thing that I did notice when looking over these runners is that on the teeth on the double chevron track molds, we don't have that large cylinder protruding from the tooth as we have on this example that we have right here. So this is something to keep in mind. So if anyone's watching this and are saying to themselves, wow, John, you know what? Yeah, you made the tracks work and, you know, you did a good job on them. However, they are far too time consuming and far too fiddly for me to assemble. Is there any other alternative out there on the market? And the answer is, well, yes, there are a few options out there. One other option that is a fairly affordable option is from the company Bronco. The Bronco working track links are similar in cost to the AFV Club ones. However, you're not really gaining anything in simplicity because those tracks are probably just as hard, if not more difficult, compared to the AFV Club counterparts. Another alternative compared to the AFV Club links are the metal versions from a number of different companies. There's Fruli, I believe Master Club may have a set also, and then there's this other company from China that makes metal links for this pattern of vehicle. Those tracks are also a viable option, and some are a little bit simpler than others to assemble. The ladder from that other company, whose link, by the way, I'll definitely put in the video description below in case anyone's interested in those, have the tooth integrally molded into the track pad, as did some of the early versions from Fruli, and this does make for a somewhat easier build compared to this one here with everything being a separate component. However, those are at the expense of cost. They are made from metal, they are easier to put together, but the side effect is that they tend to cost more. And as opposed to these sets here, which are like under 15 or 20 some odd dollars, the metal sets start at about 35 and go up from there. So this is something that you may want to consider when you're going on a build like this. And sadly, that's just a trait that are found with this pattern of track. Of all of the tank types that are out there that have been, you know, designed and made throughout the decades, the American pattern of track, like the one we have here, which is found on the Pershing, the Patton, and even the HVSS Sherman for that matter, are some of the more difficult ones to assemble, and that's because of all of the components that are found on each link, as opposed to something like a Panzer IV, a Panther, or a Tiger, where it's just a single link that gets pinned together, or something like a T-34, where it's just two types of link that get pinned together. On these type of tanks here, you'll see that each track pad consists of about 4 or 5 pieces, and even though most of them are consolidated on one link, there are still 3 other parts that got to get assembled to it. So this does lend to more complexity. It's just the nature of the beast. So this is definitely something to keep aware for anyone who is interested in a vehicle like this here, but are going to need to find a replacement for the tracks. These vehicles are really, really fun to build. However, this does come with the caveat that there is added complexity with the track. There are some versions of the Dragon M46 over here that were later re-released that had single-piece vinyl tracks. That might be a better option for you if you want to avoid the workable track route, and if you definitely hate and despise individual link as much as I do, that might be something to look forward to. But as aside for all of that, the AFV Club Pershing and Patton tracks are far from being impossible to put together. They go together very well, and obviously once they are fitted to the model, they definitely do the charm and do the job very well. Also, in case anyone is wondering, those other track types that I mentioned before are more than likely going to end up getting their own review and tutorial video for them as well, but of course this is something that's going to happen over time as I eventually gather more of these kits. However, until I get to those sets, I have absolutely no reservations or problems whatsoever with utilizing the AFV Club workable track links for my own personal builds. And with that, that wraps up this workable track link review and tutorial video for the 1/35 scale AFV Club T80E1 track sets. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being workable track link tutorial and review videos like this one over here, or the other small scale model showcase videos and large scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.